Hey everybody, how's it going? Thanks for joining me this afternoon. I've got a great stream with a great guest that I think you're really going to enjoy. Before we get started here, I wanted to let you know that here at Blaze Media, we've always stood for truth, freedom, and faith in God and country, and those aren't just words. It's a commitment we strive to live by every day. And now we want to help you carry your faith with you in your week, wherever you are. Starting this Sunday, we're launching a new series called Sunday Revival. New episodes will be available every Sunday morning for Blaze TV subscribers. You'll hear inspiring messages from leaders like Pastor Jack Graham of Prestonwood Baptist Church, Pastor Alan Jackson from World Outreach Church, Josh Howerton at Lake Point Church, Rob McCoy from Godspeak Calvary Chapel, and many more to come. Join us each week and discover additional perspectives to help you deepen and understand your faith. Regardless of what's happening in our chaotic world, Sunday Revival is here to help you grow. Stay grounded in God's word and continue to strengthen your faith. So join us on Sunday at Blaze TV and start your week with purpose, faith, and inspiration. All right, guys, speaking of deepening your understanding of faith, many people in the modern world, I think, are seeking meaning right now. I think a lot of people are turning to Christianity, recognizing not only that they need a deep spiritual connection, but they need to connect with the faith of their fathers, the faith that helped to spawn the civilizations in which they live. But of course, unfortunately, in many cases, that Christianity has been watered down. It's a real problem that has been talked about for a long time and very decisively by Friedrich Nietzsche. So, as Christians, is there something we can learn by reading one of the most arch opponents of our faith? Joining me today to discuss this is a man with great philosophical knowledge, Athenian Stranger. Thank you so much for coming on.
Man, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate this. This is a very great honor. So glad to be here.
Of course, and you're I know you are someone who is a Christian but is also deeply read in Nietzsche, and I think a lot of people are afraid to approach Nietzsche because obviously he is someone who's going to challenge one's faith. And we'll get into the question of whether Christians should be even reading this up front, or maybe only some Christians should. Maybe it will test others, but others it's too much. But I think most importantly, there's a depth of thought that exists in Nietzsche that if you are prepared, if you are strong in your faith, will allow you to look at it critically and then recognize that ultimately the truth is there, but that there are parts of modernity that have changed the way that we see the world and affected the way that we live a effective Christian life. So we're going to dive into the question of Nietzsche and whether he can help us better understand the strengths of our Christian faith. But before we get started with that, let's hear it from today's sponsor. Wake up, America, and fuel your morning with a cup of coffee that salutes the stars and stripes. We're talking about Crockett Coffee. Their blends start with premium beans, artisan roasted in small batches in America's heartland, unlocking a rich, smooth flavor that turns your first sip into pure rally the day energy. But here's the real kicker. 10% of every dollar goes straight to Tunnel to Towers, supporting our nation's heroes and their families. So when you brew Crockett, you're not just waking up, you're standing up for the people that have put it all on the line for our freedoms. I've tried a couple of the roast options, and now I'm drinking a cup every morning. So are you ready to join the coffee revolution? Head over to crockettcoffee.com. That's crockettcoffee.com. And make sure to use the promo code THEBLAZE for 15% off your order. That's promo code The Blaze for 15% off. All right, so Stranger, I think the biggest question for most people, like I said, is going to be the one that ends up getting asked first, which is, should Christians even bother to read Nietzsche? Because I think there is a level at which people should guard their hearts. They should understand that ultimately their faith is the most important thing, and maintaining it is the most important thing. Some people say, oh, well, if you don't test it, if you're not willing to question it in every way, then is it really faith? But I'm not always sure that's true. I think some people have a deep enough understanding and are, solid enough in their faith to gain even more strength from reading someone like Nietzsche, as where others perhaps are not familiar enough with the arguments or the theology, the spirituality underlying their beliefs. And someone like Nietzsche could ultimately push them in a bad direction. What are your thoughts in general about Christians of different levels of experience and perhaps intellectual heft diving into Nietzsche?
Right. So what I've said for a very long time is that thoughtful Christians are the ones who, if they simply dismiss or ignore the thought of Nietzsche, I need to correct that. I was when you studied at a certain level, your professors will yell at you if you don't pronounce it with the German Nietzsche. But I don't like those kind of pretensions. I speak English for English people.
That's
but
correct.
but
I don't call him Spangler either.
right. I can't stand that stuff. It's so pretentious. Here's the thing. Thoughtful Christians should be extremely concerned with familiarizing themselves with the thought of Nietzsche, because the way that the best expression Rousseau hands it to us is he says his books are so successful because he takes his readers as they are. In other words, he doesn't require of them that they meet him on his level. He meets them on their level. Nietzsche, more than anybody else, diagnosed the ills of what we understand as the world that we live in today, which is to say nihilism more than anything. Now, that being said, the vast majority of Christians, they don't care about depth of thought with regards to either theology or philosophy, and I personally think that that is healthy. I don't think that people of faith should so much concern themselves with all this kind of depth of thought and philosophy and deep theology and things like that. I mean, but there's a place for it, of course, for because if you're going to, for instance, attempt to proselytize, which we are as Christians called to do, then you have to understand the world around you in which you're going to be proselytizing. You have to understand, in a sense, like for instance, this is Plato's Socrates. He's always asking questions and not really giving answers, because he knows that to truly reach somebody, you have to be able to understand their soul. And you understand their soul by understanding what their beliefs are. And most people's beliefs are informed in one way or another by this culture that we live in that is so thoroughly nihilistic.
Mm.
And that's why I think it's important to understand Nietzsche, because, as I said, he has diagnosed so well everything from the culture to what he refers to as the Enlightenment ideals, which is to say everything of the modern world that we value so greatly, things like egalitarianism, democracy. He even talks about it with regard to Christianity and things like that. But also and especially people who are not Christians or who have an axe to grind against Christians, they are going to gravitate towards Nietzsche, because Nietzsche is just about the most eloquent of all philosophers who have ever lived, and he knew it. You cannot separate Nietzsche's rhetoric from his philosophy, and so that's important because of the attacks that Nietzsche hurls mercilessly against Christianity. Christians are well served understanding what those attacks are, so they know what they're up, so they know what they're going to face as they go out, for instance, and just live their daily lives with other people in conversation, or at the furthest extreme with regard to actually living their piety, witnessing or proselytizing, these kinds of things. And so that's what makes Nietzsche just so absolutely crucial. He overtook the world. Most people are Nietzscheans without even really knowing it, because the world we live in is so thoroughly, like I said, nihilistic and things like that. So.
Yeah, it's definitely one of those scenarios, and I certainly have not read as much of him as you have, but the few books I have read, the thing that I get out of them very clearly is a accurate representation of where the world was going and the kind of men we are producing now. You don't have to like his solutions for those problems. I certainly don't. But as an accurate description of how we got here and why, and the condition that we find ourselves in, and how much of this, like you said, has been absorbed into the culture without them really knowing it. Those insights I think ultimately are very valuable. And so to just kind of condense what you were saying there, I think kind of what you're saying is, for the average person who is, just going to church on Sunday and trying to live their best life, but isn't overly contemplative about their faith because they have to, they're working and they have a family and other things. Nietzsche might just not be something you want to dive into if you haven't read other, deep thinkers in the Christian tradition that can help you to buttress some of your beliefs alongside what Nietzsche is saying. But if you are someone who has done that, if you have looked into a little bit of, the deeper thought in the Christian world, and you are more interested in kind of challenging and understanding your faith, then Nietzsche can be a valuable companion because, like any good enemy, it can sharpen you. It can point out where your weak spots are. It can help you to understand why you find yourself in a world that is in this particular condition and why it feels the way or thinks the way it does about Christianity, and then can adjust and figure out a way forward from there. But you mentioned nihilism obviously several times there. That's a word that a lot of people associate with Nietzsche. Now, I think when people throw around the term nihilism, they often have this very loose understanding. Like they think of maybe, the Big Lebowski and the nihilists. They believe in nothing,
Yeah, yeah.
that kind of thing. But obviously, Nietzsche's nihilism was somewhat different. Now, he did, I think, uh, diagnose the condition a lot of people think of as nihilism, but his nihilism had a prescriptive nature to it, which was much different than I think a lot of people understand. So, could you give us kind of your understanding of the term nihilism as you're using it here?
Sure. Now, for the listeners, I think this is so important. I mean, I have an entire series that I've done hours and hours of recorded uh, lectures on this topic of technology and nihilism, and in particular Nietzsche, etc. Uh, uh, Everything's transferred over to Substack right now because the websites are just so difficult. But the issue of nihilism is nothing new under the sun. In fact, it is book one of Plato's Republic, where Glaucon, the youth, the most talented of the youth, they flatly say, Socrates, will you please defend justice for us because our ears have been talked off by people like Thrasymachus, who are telling us that the just man is a sucker. The way that Machiavelli phrases it when he's critiquing Christianity is he says that the problem with good men is that we live in a world of so many bad men. And effectively, what this is, think of it as an ism, like it's the Latin there, nihil, just means nothing. So nothing ism. In other words, no truths. Nothing grounds anything. Now, this is extremely important for in many respects. Nietzsche is the culmination of all of these things. Nietzsche is not. Most people know that Nietzsche shouted, "God is dead" from the rooftops, right? That's what he's famous for, is the phrase "God is dead." But this was nothing new. It was something that had been a long-standing issue within the European tradition, even from the beginning of modernity. Uh, and one could even say even further. But the thing about nihilism is that it is so pervasive, the way that the things that we consider to be virtue, right? Uh, Courage, moderation, justice, wisdom, these things. Um, those are the foundations, the conceptual foundations upon which we understand how to live the good life, right? What nihilism is it says, no, these things are not, they're not virtues, they are what we call values. Nietzsche is the one who introduces this term. He takes it from painting. Painters create different colors by blending them together. They shade them together to become values. And so that's why whenever you hear people say, well, these are our values, or those are their values, well, that's when you say, stop. That's directly a product of nihilism, because what it claims is that there's no such thing as, a universal concept of like the good, which is to say justice, moderation, sophrosina, prudence, right? These kinds of things. But it's so pervasive. Many people believe that they can critique nihilism from somehow standing outside of it, as if they're not already deeply infected by it. They don't even realize that the jokes we laugh at, the television shows we watch, the movies we watch, all of these things are already so thoroughly nihilistic. We're all tied up in it. Nietzsche never really gives a definition of it. He gives many different descriptions, and sometimes he gives definitions of it. But ultimately, what it comes down to, what I think is his best approach to saying what nihilism is that modern man no longer really knows what to believe. And the way he phrases it is he says that we don't have any firmness, any resolve behind our yeses and our nos. In other words, someone proposes something to us and we say, well, okay, yeah, sure, whatever. Or we'll say, I don't really know about that. Uh, Most people today, they don't have that firmness where they say, no, we don't do that here. Or yes, of course we do that here, right? Something like this. And that's ultimately what it is. I mean, one of the probably the most common definition of nihilism is that all values undermine themselves, right? In other words, if you examine them closely enough, it turns out that they don't. The method of inquiry by which you use, whether it's science or philosophy or logic or something, it's just going to show that it's not, as Immanuel Kant would say, apodictic certainty, right? In other words, you can't establish it as objective. A very dangerous word itself, objectivity there.
Yeah.
But that's effectively it. Is that people mostly just sort of shrug their shoulders and say, well, okay, sure, or well, I don't really know, but we'll see, right? And that shows itself, unfortunately, in the most important circumstances. For instance, attending church on Sunday. People will say, I don't have to go to church to be a pious Christian, whatever. Or, if you're on a date or something like that and it's going really well, and, it's like, well, you want to go back to my place? Okay, sure. And then, what happens from there? It's like, well, it's just sort of this kind of thing. And we see it in modern cultures, people saying things like, well, they're living their best life, as if there's multiple lives that are all, on the same playing field, or they're saying, he or she is living their truth, as if truth is a deck of cards that one can sort of take out of one's pocket and say, well, here it is today and here it is tomorrow, blah, blah, blah.
I know that this term has become almost a meme at this point because it's been so overused, but a lot of people will point to Nietzsche as the first postmodernist because of his direct declaration of, a lack of this foundation, this truth, this binding understanding of the good. Do you think that's an accurate? I don't want to spend 20 minutes debating postmodernism, but do you feel like that's an accurate description for Nietzsche, or is this just a recognition of a process, as you said, that's been ongoing since Plato?
Well, you are correct, of course, that is the standard approach to defining whatever this thing is called postmodernism that people say. They say Nietzsche started it. Uh, he did not. He's the culmination of it. And he's the one who makes it, he's the culmination of it, and he clarifies it better than anyone else has. What happens effectively is that and Nietzsche credits, in fact, Rousseau with this, is that Rousseau looks at modernity, modern liberalism, and he says, there are some fundamental problems here that undermine all of it. This business about the social contract and the state of nature and these kinds of things, upon which you have built the entirety of this new politics that we all celebrate. It has such fundamental flaws in its premises that all of it is it's a sandcastle built too close to the ocean or something like this, right? And this has to do with what's going to eventually become known as evolutionary theory, right? These kinds of things.
Mhm.
And Kant is the one who responds to this. Kant is responding to Rousseau on the one hand, because what Rousseau says is that there's no getting civilization itself, this thing we call civilization. Rousseau gives us the word the bourgeois, the man who is nothing, because this thing called civilization is just a thin patina, a tincture of thinking that we have progressed beyond others. And the problem, in fact, is our technology has it creates new desires. And so we are always in pursuit of those new desires. And so we can never find an inner stability. We can never be at peace from whatever our natural state would be or something like that. And then Hume, of course, is the one who attacks the notion of causality. And you combine those two together and you have just this deep, deep philosophical nihilism. Kant is the one who responds to both of them. And then you're often running with the entirety of German idealism that tries to solve this problem, the solution of which is what becomes this word culture. And that ends up, it's a heavy emphasis upon human reason. And that ends up ultimately failing. And most everyone has already recognized that it's failed. And Nietzsche just flatly is the one who says, look, it's over, guys. None of these things are believable anymore. And so what do we do now? What do we do? And so what Nietzsche is the founder of effectively is the so-called return movements. He's looking back over the entire tradition and he's saying something fundamental has gone wrong. And it's not just Rousseau, it's not modernity, it's not the Middle Ages. It is, in fact, Socrates, Plato's Socrates. And this is where Nietzsche is fundamentally a philosopher of science. He is fundamentally concerned with science, technology, and this thing that we're going to know of as culture. How do we make these things work going forward? Because according to Nietzsche's analysis, what it has all resulted in is that man is a domesticated houseplant. He calls him a dwarf of a man. A dwarf of a man that's a plant more than anything, an effeminate plant, unmanly, these sorts of things. And so he's deeply concerned with that now. The fundamental elements there are going to be twofold. Modern science, on the one hand, is the problem. And on the other hand, Nietzsche is going to associate Christianity with that problem, because when you combine those two things, science, which is to say the pursuit of the knowledge of the natures of things, and then what Nietzsche refers to as the newest virtue, Redlichkeit, honesty. He says that's what's coming from Christianity. When you combine those two things, when you have Christians who are honest, they are also in pursuit of science, then that is what ultimately leads to the condition in which all values or all virtues undermine themselves, because the scientist can no longer deny the fact that he can't find. Now, I'm not saying this is Nietzsche speaking. He's saying the scientist can no longer deny the fact that he can't find God in his science. That's the great problem. And so then you have this, with Nietzsche, you have this word probity, intellectual honesty. And what he's saying is that is fundamentally diagnosed because of, as I said, science, which Nietzsche associates with Socrates. He flatly says Socrates is the origin of cause and effect, the notion of cause and effect. And then Christianity, on the other hand, which is honesty. No such thing as lying anymore. In fact, lying is a sin. So it is to be avoided at all cost. And that's ultimately what it ends up being in the grand scheme of things. That's the diagnostic aspect of Nietzsche. The helpful way to understand Nietzsche is in two broad chunks. On the one hand, he's diagnosing what has happened. And then on the other hand, he's saying, okay, now we have to have a prognostic. What do we do going forward? And then that's going to be the elements of the so-called overman, et cetera, these kinds of things. But the God is dead and we killed him. That's the important point. What Nietzsche refers to as God is dead and we killed him, this in nihilism through science and Christianity, according to him, is that it is the most unique death in the history of mankind. It's utterly unlike the death of Zeus or something like that, because not only is it a death, a murder, but it's a suicide. The suicide being what he's going to say is the Christian role of honesty, and the fact that man has just become intoxicated with the pursuit of science. Science has become a passion.
So it's kind of interesting, and obviously this is some speculation, but that's why you're here as well. What do you think would have been his response, or what ultimately is your response to the fact that actually what we've seen now is that science has needed to become very dishonest in order to avoid the evidence of God in its practice. I think we see pretty regularly at this point scientists who are ignoring data or possible solutions because they could point to a metaphysical reality. We see a lot of the Reddit atheist types, but even the serious scientists knock around things like simulation theory and multiple universe theories and all these things that are radical speculations that are wildly unscientific and are clearly just there to paper over the fact that they keep running into the logical evidence, I think, of an existence beyond our own. And so it feels like now the religion of science that is to be dishonest about these truths and to shield the public from the idea that there could be things beyond science that it can no longer define. I know that's probably not directly in the storyline, but I just kind of thought that is an
No,
interesting development we've seen that Nietzsche never would have, obviously.
no, I'm glad you asked that because that's a fundamental question for Nietzsche himself.
Mm,
So, first of all, let's be clear. Nietzsche was a trained classical philologist. And what that means is that he was, I mean, there's more to it than this, but he was an expert. He was, in fact, the youngest tenured professor in German history. He was such an expert at languages, particularly Greek and Latin. The word science is episteme, and it just means, from Greek, it just means knowledge. Now, it's going to take on a particular format. It requires that we say, okay, well, what is characteristic of that form of knowledge? Now, for Nietzsche, what he takes as a premise, and I'll just sort of read this. This is in his essay on history, which is really an essay on science. He calls them the deadly truths of science. And he says the doctrine of sovereign becoming, in other words, everything is fundamental flux. He says of the fluidity of all concepts, in other words, fundamental concepts, things like good and evil, right? They're fluid. They're, in other words, they're the same. It says right, up and down, these things are the same. And then he says uh, no cardinal distinctions between species, between man and animal, these kinds of things. So fundamental fluidity of all things. He is a thorough, we could say, Heraclitean, or, and as I like to say, that's why he loves Thucydides. Now, but Nietzsche, but because of those things, because they are so fundamentally fluid, what that means is that science itself is a kind of well, a kind of poetry, a kind of making, because there's no stability within the flux. And so, in late in his career, when he's looking back over all his published publications in 1886, 1887, he goes back and he writes prefaces for all of his works, except Zarathustra, because Zarathustra is both the beginning and the end. He would call it the Alpha and the Omega. He loves to bring in Christian imagery. And what he says about his first book, The Birth of Tragedy, from the Spirit of Music, is he says he's looking back at it and he says, you know, what really that book was about, I had gotten a hold of a question that no one before me had ever understood. And he said he calls it the problem of Socrates, but he says it's really the problem of science. And then he says, science, the problem of science cannot be solved from within the realm of science. And then he goes on and he says what we and what I refer to it as the kind of kaleidoscope theory. This is how, now the reason this is important is because this speaks to the fundamental unity of all of Nietzsche's thought, which is so thoroughly political. It's a kaleidoscope. What he says, the way he ends the second section, is he says,
well, I lost you there for a second. Yeah,
I wanted
sorry
to,
guys. Oh, Stranger, you
oh,
back?
oh, when did you lose me? Sorry.
You dropped out for about 10 or so seconds there.
Oh, okay,
Uh,
okay. So he's looking back over his career, and he's in The Birth of Tragedy. He's writing these prefaces, and he says, "I had gotten a hold of the problem of Socrates, which is really the problem of science." And he says it can't be solved from within the realm of science. then he has this is so fundamental because it's the unity of all of Nietzsche's thought here, because it's so thoroughly political. He says, what I was attempting to do, which no one had done, was I was looking at science, and this is like the kaleidoscope theory of the phenomenal whole that is philosophy, that is we understand as the world around us, our life of man. And he says to look at science through the prism of the artist, but also to look at art through the prism of life. And so, to return to your question about how it is that science is so thoroughly not scientific, they're a bunch of liars, they manipulate the data. Nietzsche would say, well, yeah, that's what science is for. You have to, he said, they're poor artists. They're horrible. They're last men. He calls them the dung beetle. But what he says is that because science effectively teaches, today at least, that humans are just mostly hairy bags of water. That's why Nietzsche says we have to use art. Science has been too mean to man. And the only way to justify life going forward is to use art somehow to make the findings of science more amenable to man, so that man can flourish in life instead of being just an acid bath upon all of his sacred truths. But he would not be surprised whatsoever at what we're seeing with the perversion of science, as we all saw over COVID, and we continue to see in all of peer review, the journal. I mean, everything. It's just so thoroughly corrupt. He was so ahead of the times. He trashed the universities before anyone was really He trashed the universities when the rest of the world was saying that the German universities were the greatest in the world, because they had just been corrupt.
I have no hard time believing he's a contrarian at every possible turn, but how does this is what I'm trying to grasp here. How does this jive though with his assertion that Christian honesty is like part of this process of killing God? Then, because if he says the honesty of the Christian compels the scientist to tell the truth that he cannot find God in his science, but then the scientist actually is not compelled towards truth and he's easily corrupted and can lie for his own advantage, or even forget just the COVID narrative and all that stuff, but again, the direct denials of God's presence even when it's found inside the work. How do these things work simultaneously? That's what's confusing me here.
Yeah. The problem is that, and this goes back to the fact that Nietzsche is not the first. As I said, he's the culmination.
Mhm.
People are no longer believers. That war has been lost. Now, this is Nietzsche talking, but again, it's not just Nietzsche. It's the entirety of the 19th century at the levels of academia. What they had found, they believed to have found, was that they just could not find, and this is where philology comes back into play, because what philology does is it teaches us how to understand the most ancient of all of our manuscripts. And again, this gets back to why it's so important for Christians to familiarize themselves with the thought of Nietzsche, because that has everything to do with the Bible itself. How reliable are the texts of the Bible? These kinds of things. And so what you have in the 19th century is the search for the historical Moses, and then it culminates in the search for the historical Jesus, these kinds of things. And what the academics are finding is they're saying we can't find any. There's it's not there. And then so you get the rise of the so-called allegorical or the mythical understanding of what the Bible teaches. And then next thing you've got people that are saying you can be a Christian without the Bible at all. And so it was long already standard practice that academics just were not Christians for the most part. They were not believers. And so Nietzsche would say, well, yeah, of course. I mean, the honesty remained, and the honesty just told them that, their God is dead, but they keep the honesty and keep going, it's sort of to make themselves these new gods. And the new gods that Nietzsche is always railing against are what he refers to as the modern ideals, egalitarianism, democracy. He has his harshest critic. He rails against socialism. He has such a particular hatred for socialism that it's almost impossible to put into words. Some of the funniest lines he ever has to say are about socialism, but also progress, the notion of progress. He says that is the most insane idea that man has ever created, because look around, look what's happening to Europe, look what's happening to modern man. And well, anyway, I'm sort of rambling here. I'll let you sort of
No, that's
continue
okay.
that
No,
because
I was just listening because I was that was very helpful in grasping the totality of that answer. It makes much more sense that yeah, they
and
basically they've
that's a no, that's his turn to culture, by the way. I mean, he says
Mhm.
this in his second and his third book. uh, he's so fundamentally concerned with the notion of science and culture; they go hand in hand. uh, because he says we have to find a way to live flourishingly now. And what he flatly says is in Human All Too Human is he says people often think that he announces the death of God, for instance, in it's book 4, Joyous Science, and then of course Zarathustra. That's not true. I mean, he flatly talks about it in Human All Too Human. He says now that most people don't even believe anymore, we have to get on with the business of life. And he says, in order to do that, we have to come to a rigorous scientific understanding of what this thing called culture is. Because everything that has passed for culture, whether it was Christian culture, whether it was commercial culture, and then what he diagnoses as the most dangerous of all cultures, machine culture, technology. He says these things are death spirals. And so that's what has to be taken forward, uh, going forward, with these philosophy and science, and that's his radical redefinition of science. He says, looking back over the entirety of the tradition of philosophy, science, and politics, he says every true artist, every true thinker, every true philosopher has always been threefold. He's been the philosopher, he's been the lawgiver, and he's wanted to stamp the impress of his values, what he thinks is good and evil, upon the rest of mankind, uh, as a kind of stamp upon the wax, something to that effect. And so that's what he's pointed to going forward. And from all of that is going to come the Overman. But I do have to say, though, he this is what he says about Christianity. I mean, it would be an entirely incomplete discussion if one didn't at least include what he says about Christianity. Is he says the greatest thing about it is historically, at least, he says it was such a success. And that's why he has this famous line of Caesar with the soul of Christ. And so when people realized that he wrote this book called Antichrist, and he calls himself the Antichrist. Really, the book should be titled Anti-Christian, because he has the greatest respect for Christ, but not for the reasons that a Christian would, right? This is thoroughly Machiavellian. He's saying that
Right.
Christ was the greatest of all founders, because look at what he accomplished. Look at the tradition that came out of him. But in his greatest animosity and hatred, though, is for Paul. He said Christ had things right, and then he says Paul messed it all up. So
Well, before we move to the application for Christians in the modern world, are there any other critical um, criticisms or parts of Christianity or modern Christianity, things that he found weak or otherwise hollowed out or not being sincere? Are there any things that we need to address before moving forward to how Christians can then take those lessons into the modern world?
well, just sort of a kind of an itemized listing here of what people uh, can expect if they look into the thought of Nietzsche. These are thematic. They're definitive of Nietzsche's thought. He's fundamentally concerned with the relationship between faith and reason. He has numerous entire aphorisms devoted to it. He has entire aphorisms devoted to telling us what faith is, what it was in the Christian tradition. He also tells us what uh, our new faith is. And he says, we, talking to his reader who sympathizes with him. And then later, hilariously, he says, I only say we to be polite, because no one's ready for my truths. In a letter in 1886, he actually tells someone, he says, it's probably going to take about 2,000 years for anyone to even be ready to read Beyond Good and Evil. But one thing I left out, and this is what is so important, is that because we in America have short attention spans. Look at the timeline on X, the news cycle. Nietzsche took America by storm in the 20th century. And he did it by way of Christianity. It was the Christians who brought Nietzsche into America and popularized him. And not just any Christians, it was the academics. So the same people that you see railing against all of the people on X who are, I don't know, whatever dissident right or whatever you want to call it, the Nietzscheans or something, they are the ones, the academics are the ones who brought Nietzsche to America and celebrated him. He was taught in all of the most prestigious of the Ivy League theological seminaries. This is both in the Catholic tradition in America and the Protestant tradition. I mean, I could provide an avalanche of just how definitive he was in the early 20th century of America, both in Catholicism and in Protestantism. It's just absolutely incredible. But the one thing that stands out the most is that people should be aware of, just as a matter of historical fact, that's, I think, just profoundly deep. Many people blame what happens in America. They point to the 60s. They are not correct. The civil rights movement was nothing more than the culmination of what began as the social gospel movement in the late 19th and early 20th century. The social gospel, the most prominent of them, the advocates of the social gospel, they were arguing directly on behalf of Nietzsche. And in fact, many of the greatest professors in these theological seminaries were flatly saying that the question going forward, the capital THE question, is whether or not Christ is the overman. And then Margaret Sanger, the infamous Margaret Sanger, was making arguments for an Uberfrau, an overwoman, these kinds of things. So, I mean, Nietzsche just defined the first half of the 20th century in America at every level. Everyone pretended that didn't happen, of course, after the 1950s and World War II. With Nazi Germany, the academics want to pretend that they didn't do it all. They brought it all to us. They disseminated it to us, and they want to pretend that their hands are clean of it. And now they can't stop scribbling out all their essays and books, trashing the hell out of conservatives or anyone on the far right. So that's important, very important.
So we can obviously, this topic is vast. Nietzsche's obviously, people spend their entire lives studying this guy, so we're not going to be able to do it all justice in an hour. But if there are a few things that you could leave the audience with as Christians, if they are Christians, and if you're not, guys, you should become Christian. Christ is indeed King, and the only way to heaven, the only way to save your soul. However, if we're talking to the Christians in the audience, and they are looking at Nietzsche's work, what can they take? Are there a couple things that they could take into the modern world from Nietzsche that will help strengthen their faith, or make them more effective Christians, or make them more effective at addressing the nihilism that we find ourselves adrift in the modern world?
Yes, and in many respects, that's why I mentioned that sort of digression just a second ago about how Nietzsche overtook early 20th century America by way of Christianity, both Catholicism and Protestantism. Nietzsche is so much of the two things one could say that really are the pillars of all of his thought are on the one. Now, this is going to sound strange, and I've been attacked for saying it, but I mean, I can speak for hours, literally just reading textually and from his unpublished notebooks and letters, where this is simply true. This is what made Nietzsche so appealing, both to people who dislike Christianity, and in many cases hate it, and Christians who are very pious and want to see Christianity succeed. The two pillars are, on the one hand, Nietzsche advocates that we have to relearn what it means to actually love. We have a corrupt understanding of what love is. And associated with that, and one could maybe even say more foundational, is the notion of compassion or pity. And the German word is Mitleiden, which means leiden being to suffer, and mit meaning with. So with suffering. And Nietzsche is the one who says the problem is that Christianity has turned into a religion of pity, of compassion. And this is going to be what we often speak of as the people who will wear the dead skin of that which we hold most sacred, right? And they'll say that they are it, right? And so you have the Christians who are saying, Christ would have not only embraced but loved and accepted transgenders, homosexuals, illegal immigrants, all these kinds of things. And Nietzsche would say, no, what you have there is the perversion of this concept of pity that you have appropriated and turned it into your Christian religion. So that's extremely helpful. I mean, some of the most important things that he ever says concern this notion of pity and such. In fact, one way
Well,
he
we can.
defines nihilism is through pity. Yeah.
Well, one thing we can see is it's not, you're exactly right, of course, and he's exactly right that there are, people claiming to be Christians who will pervert the faith by this exploitation of the idea of pity. But at this point, there's even the meme of the non-Christians doing this, right? Like this is the Twitter meme of well, I'm not a Christian, but you are, and so I'm going to use my faith, your faith, and calls to pity to manipulate you. And so now it's not just people inside the faith who recognize that they perhaps can use this way, but it's even non-Christians cynically will say, oh well, this is what I've reduced your faith down to, and you're so weak in your faith that you will follow this call to compassion and pity even if it has no foundation in the actual teachings of Christ. And that's a way that you can constantly attempt to manipulate people even if you yourself don't believe.
Yes, and also something that just occurred to me is that, and I see this all the time. This could be of help at least, because remember, look, I am a Christian, but I see my job as on X and such, and with my little Athens corner and all the tutoring and stuff that I do is to be someone who just uh, shares the genuine teaching to be found in the great books. I don't particularly take sides because I mean I have sides, but I don't take them when I'm teaching it because you can't. You have to be fair, right? That's the role of honesty. But what you will find is many times people will say that they are Nietzscheans, or you will get, for instance, academics critiquing the far right or something and saying a bunch of godless Nietzscheans. Nietzsche would laugh hysterically at anyone who said there was even such thing as a Nietzschean. Nietzsche says over and over and over again, he does not want people who are his mere followers. He said he wants people that will reach for his crown. In other words, he wants people that are going to overcome him. And so the concept of the fact that you would say someone is a Nietzschean, and if someone were to say that they are a Nietzschean, they don't understand Nietzsche. They haven't read him or something like that. So these kinds of things are again important as things that one can carry in one's little intellectual toolkit as they go out into the world and are confronted by these things that on the one hand are going to be, I mean, we always have to recognize, is this person friend or foe, right? What are their beliefs? And so, you have to have this kind of little toolkit with you of knowledge and say, well, I know at least this much about it, which is kind of makes what you're saying either right. So you might be a friend, or it makes what you're saying wrong. So I'm going to hang a question mark over whether you're a friend or an enemy or something like that.
So you mentioned the manipulation through the idea of pity and compassion, the warping of those things. Are there other things that we should be watching out for as Christians that Nietzsche highlighted, or things that'll help us understand again that the kind of overcoming the nihilism that we find ourselves in?
Yeah, I mean that's the question is it even possible to overcome it at this point?
Mm.
Because it is so unique in the history of mankind. Like I said, the death of the biblical God is unlike the death or the disappearance of any other gods prior in man's history. And what Nietzsche is fundamentally concerned with, what I try to get across to people, is these two words, culture and civilization. What Nietzsche is going to effectively say, he has a number of fascinating comments about this, is he says that, civilization is that which we see around us, right? That we pride ourselves on, right? The beautiful buildings, these kinds of things. The culture is going to be what that civilization is supposed to have created within us, that is exemplary of how we achieved that civilization. So think of it this way: the culture is the education of the soul or of yourself that makes you, human, separates you from all the other animals. And what Nietzsche says is our problem is that there is a conflict between culture and civilization. What we have is in other words, we're civilized barbarism, right? That's the thing that he emphasizes the most, is that uh, because this belief in progress is so just visceral and everyone just simply believes it. Nietzsche says, look, you have to understand this thing you call civilization. You scratch the surface on that just a little bit, and you're still barbarians, for God's sake. And so finding a way forward absolutely has to entail in other words, the political solution going forward is how can you make the civilization and the culture, uh, how can you reconcile these two things, right? That's the key thing. And that's ultimately going to come down to the issue of education. And for Nietzsche, at least, it's going to be hierarchies, the order of rank among men, that kind of thing. That's ultimately what's at issue with everyone's familiar with the master slave morality he speaks of, or for instance, the overman and the last man. Uh, all of that has to do with the order of rank among human beings. But the question, though, is how do you establish that order of rank if there's a fundamental fluidity to all concepts, right? If nihilism is in fact true, and then you get into the question of, well, what's life? For Nietzsche, the answer is that which is good is always that which is life affirming, which is going to come down to a kind of instinctual understanding. Like attracts like, something like that. And that's where things become very, very complicated to understand, because what Nietzsche has done, and this is where we are in postmodernity, Heidegger takes it even further. The French just go insane with it, is that we're at the limits of language, the possibility of logos. In other words, what mind itself can actually articulate versus what one feels in a kind of experiential or revelationary uh, way. And so that's why it's one of the funniest phenomena in the study of Nietzsche is there are many people, well, not many, but there are people who publish books, tenured professors, saying that Christianity is in fact, or Nietzsche is in fact reconcilable with Christianity. I have exactly zero patience for that whatsoever. It's completely false. But you can see how that element is there once you're into the realm of the breaking down of speech or mind to articulate things. And that's why we've had this turn to so-called poetic thinking, poetic philosophizing, these kinds of things that Nietzsche really, one could almost say Nietzsche really kicks that off. But again, that was a longstanding tradition in the German idealist tradition, going back at least to Schelling and all the romantics and things like that. So.
Well, Stranger, we are stacking up the super chats. And like I said, obviously, this is a very deep, deep subject that we could go on, and you have gone on for hours at length about. So if people have enjoyed this talk and they want to further understand this topic and find the rest of your work, where should they go?
Um, so I have my website, athenscorner.com, but I'm transferring everything over to Substack. So you can find me on Substack at Athens Corner. That's where things are until I can get the website situated much better. Uh, and find me on Twitter, of course, at Athens Stranger. But I really I'm enjoying Substack. Like I said, at Athens Corner, you can find me there. And this is just what I do. I mean, I have hours and hours and hours of these lectures going through everything from the Bible to Homer to Thucydides to Nietzsche to the moderns. I'm particularly interested in biblical interpretation and the history of it, the problem of the rise of the German universities, which is to say the universities as we understand them today, all of these things. And I have the body of work is growing. So and when you asked me about coming on to talk about this, it was almost one of those things like, this is the hand of God itself. Because I've been working for 8 months now on what's at this point over 4 hours of an introduction to the entirety of the thought of Nietzsche, that's encompassing of an entire history of nihilism itself, what it is, where you can find it, how it's transformed, how it has defined and affected the world that we live in. So.
Fantastic. Well, you definitely let me know when that is finished and we'll share that out. And of course, all of your other work is available over at Substack. So if people would like to know more, would like to find more, they have that opportunity and they should, of course, avail themselves of it. All right, guys, let's head to the questions of the people here real quick. I've got Weird Curb who says, I lived in the Bible Belt my whole life and never hear the true gospel until 29. I can testify to watered down Christianity being real. Yeah, that's such an incredible tragedy because, of course, obviously, just the watering down of the Christian message. But the other thing that really drives me nuts for a lot of the modern churches, of course, the evangelism, missionaries, these things are critical. But oftentimes people are skipping over the vast sea of people right next to them who do not know Christ because of the nihilism they swim in, to go to Africa or Eastern Europe or the middle of Asia. And not that those people don't need Christ, but just amazing how many people uh, ignore the nihilism at their doorstep to jump over to some other country rather than worrying about witnessing to the neighbor right around them.
Yeah, I would just also add, again, this is extremely thematic and in many ways definitive of the thought of Nietzsche. Nietzsche refers to it in many different ways, but one of his best phrasings of it that I think is helpful is he refers to it as the residue of Christianity. What you end up having is just this sort of the shadow, the fingerprints here and there
Right.
in churches, but it's really not Christianity. I mean, look at what they're. Well, I mean, I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah, much to be said on that topic for sure. Tiny Stupid Demon says, was going to ask for a thorough definition of nihilism because Athenian talks about it so much, but you beat me to it. Great job on Tucker. Keep it all up. Well, thank you very much, man. And yes, that's, Stranger is definitely great at that. That's one of the core things I wanted to make sure we understood because, like I said, nihilism is thrown around so often and so casually. So, definitely glad that we could clarify that at the beginning because it is such a key concept, obviously, to what Nietzsche's talking about and just to understanding the world around us. Creeper Weird Creeper Weirdo says, so Nietzsche hates Elon. Also, I find it funny. A man so obsessed with power ended life a cripple. Yeah, obviously another topic you could probably go on length, but a lot of people point obviously to the fact that for all of his insights, all of his incredible, just deep insights into the world around us and predictions about what would happen, Nietzsche, like many philosophers, seemed not to be able to apply any of that wisdom to his own life. Does that say anything about Nietzsche and his philosophy?
Well, I really dislike those approaches to reading philosophers because you could also point to just as many of your own heroes, anyone's own heroes, in even in Christianity, and say, "Well, look at how their life ended," or something like that, right? I
Mm,
mean, you would have people who hate Christians say, "Well, look at what happened with your Christ," or something like that, right? We have to be very careful in reducing philosophy to biography, because, and this is what, and this is the most important key here, very often, and Nietzsche actually speaks about this at length regarding the so-called free spirit, the ones who are the only hope going forward is if you can have these various free spirits. In other words, they're able to break away from culture that is already just smothering the vitality of them, And he says the problem is that very often they're weak because they're so ostracized from the culture in which they live. They've seen, and Nietzsche says this, he says it's a sham fraud culture. But if you stand too far outside of it, they shun you. And you end up having to live a very, in many cases, poverty-stricken life. You're also often very weak. This is his critique of Darwinism, by the way. He does not at all, he's an evolutionary thinker, but he does not believe in Darwinism because he says survival of the fittest is stupid. If survival of the fittest were true, then it would just be the status quo. That's all it would be. And so you have to take into consideration that separating oneself from the herd, right, very often renders one very vulnerable to things which would otherwise be quite just embarrassing as a man, or affecting of your health, these kinds of things. So
But as an Ubermensch, shouldn't you be able to exist without those things? Shouldn't there be some level of ability to overcome that dependence on the culture or the world around you that you'll be deprived of by setting yourself apart from the herd?
well, that's where Nietzsche did succeed. Like I said, I mean, he was the youngest tenured professor ever
Mhm.
in Germany at 24. Retired shortly thereafter because he just couldn't stand what was happening in the universities, and then just spent his life traveling around, literally walking up and down the Alps, and writing and things like that. So he was able to overcome that aspect of it. I mean, but I mean, if people are, we have to also be careful with the overman. It's not at all clear that Nietzsche himself believes that the overman is a possibility. Most people judge the status of the overman by where he first occurs in Zarathustra,
Mhm.
but then you have to ask yourself, that's just the beginning. Where does the overman stand at the very end of Zarathustra? It's a kind of thought experiment or something. So.
Interesting. All right. Matt Greedier says, really great Tucker interview. Probably one of the best I've heard on his channel. Tucker did great asking the right questions too. Well, thank you very much, man. Again, just an honor to be able to do it. And yeah, obviously Tucker's a world class interviewer. He knows exactly what he's doing. It's a little nerve wracking because he changes subjects so often. It's a little bit like squirrel, and you kind of go the other direction. So especially when you're trying to discuss heavier topics, you're like, oh man, I hope this hangs together. I hope this makes sense. I hope that we didn't pivot away too quickly and didn't get into the important parts so that's confusing. But overall, seems to have gotten a great reception, and I'm very grateful to him, and of course, very grateful to you guys for all the support that has made that possible. Yeah, I mean, it's literally a dream come true. So what else are you gonna say? Uh, Omens says, any advice for Nietzscheans who are aligned with the interest of Christians who do not believe Christianity has the power to stave off decline? So, yeah, this is an interesting topic. Obviously, we see very often that kind of what's often called the Nietzschean or pagan right, and the kind of traditional Christian, more throne and altar right, are often pushing in a similar direction in that they are rejecting some of the problems of modernity and liberalism and these things. They see themselves broadly in some kind of right wing coalition, but they often clash. I recently had made some Nietzscheans angry about my assertion that ultimately they leave their civilization vulnerable to being overtaken by foreign faith because we will never truly be without one. So is there a way that we can work together? I mean, you kind of already said that Nietzsche's philosophy cannot be synthesized with Christianity, cannot be compatible at some level. But is there a political coalition, or are these things necessarily at odds simply because they're foundational differences?
Well, the thing to keep in mind is Nietzsche himself says he provides as and I mean it's the context in which he says this. It's difficult to understand. It's not easy, but he says Caesar with the soul of Christ. So there's something about the soul of Christ that is extremely important for Nietzsche's thought of the human type going forward. And what I would suggest to people is that this gets back around to Nietzsche's understanding of his profound understanding of human psychology and what drives history itself. The master slave morality, blah, blah, blah. All of that comes from the notion of resentment. The soul of Christ is one that is not filled with resentment. That's the thing. And so when you have a lot of young men, and trust me, I tend to be one of them, who are extremely angry about the world around us, And Nietzsche is at pains in every single one of his publications to say those who anger too easily or are too reactionary, they make for very poor students of philosophy, because you can't allow yourself to be overcome with the kind of resentment that usually results from anger. Now, Nietzsche is a fan of anger because it's needed for overcoming, for unknotting one's stomach to do the things needed. But that would, if there's a way in which to align, and there are, by the way, I mean, I'm friends with people who would otherwise, they would otherwise burn each other at the stake. The way to understand it is that there is great virtue for both of these things. And the tension, of course, is keeping them together without just, a kind of suicide or something like that. So.
All right, guys. Well, we're going to go ahead and wrap this up. Once again, want to thank Athenian Stranger for coming on. Always fantastic and fascinating to talk with him. If you have not checked out his work, you, of course, should do so as soon as we're done here. If it's your first time on this channel, then you need to go ahead and click subscribe on YouTube. You need to click the bell and the notifications so you know when we go live. If you'd like to get these broadcasts as podcasts, you need to subscribe to the Auron MacIntyre Show on your favorite podcast platform. And if you do, make sure to leave a rating or review. It really helps with the algorithm magic. Thank you, everybody, for watching. And as always, I will talk to you next time.